Hi, everyone. We are back for another talk for Minority Mental Health Month. We are doing a series of talks that some of you have been following along with different clinicians, different wellness advocates, and we're talking about BIPOC mental health this month. It is such an important topic. I'm so excited that I found so many other wonderful people in the wellness field who are also passionate about this topic. So today we have our guest Israa. I'm going to let her introduce herself. She's wonderful, and so she will introduce herself, and then we are going to discuss the topic of South Asian mental health and talking about conversations around mental health in the South Asian community. But first, I will let her introduce herself, and then we can get into it.
Hi, Divya. Thank you so much for having me, and hi, everyone who is joining to listen to us talk about BIPOC mental health and South Asian mental health. My name is Israa. I'm a therapist by training, and I'm a mental health educator and a wellness coach. And what that really means, like what all of that really means, is I work towards helping destigmatize mental health and really helping people own their narrative and own their story when it comes to their health, when it comes to their mental wellness. And my hope really is to transform the way we talk about mental health. I really want to change the way we view it and take it from a place of shame to a place of feeling empowered. And I believe that one of the best ways to do that is to talk about mental health, to educate people about mental health, to answer questions about it. And I think, these kind of platforms are one of the most effective ways to get the word out there. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. And that's why I think you would be so wonderful for having this conversation, because I totally agree with you that a really big piece is talking about it, being open about it. And it is a conversation, especially with mental health in many different cultural communities, it's a bit more of a stigmatized topic. And so right now it's been very silenced, and in that kind of way, it only perpetuates stigma. It only silences and continues to silence these conversations. So it's really about educating and starting to talk about it and kind of face those uncomfortable conversations. And so I appreciate that you've done so much in this space. And I think that it'll be like hearing about what your insights are on this topic and how you've even worked with other people and navigated other people through these conversations. I think it'll be really useful today.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. So first I want to discuss blankly in the beginning, what are we talking about right now in South Asian mental health? Like, what are some challenges with discussing mental health in the South Asian community?
Yeah, the challenges in the South Asian community right now, like if we're going to talk about, North America, let's say, right, is there is this like generational gap. We do have like the 1.5 immigrant generation or children of immigrants or second gen folks who are really diving into mental health and wellness. But the original, let's say the original immigrant group, who was perhaps like a bit of an older population, is still not there yet. So there is this divide where one group is very, very much working towards destigmatizing, understanding, increasing access, and the other group is still not there. So there's this gap that we're trying to bridge, right? So we're hearing a lot, at least I'm hearing a lot, about people talking about intergenerational trauma. People are talking about like, how do you navigate these conversations with your elders, with your parents, with your family? But the stigmas that are kind of embedded within the South Asian culture when it comes to mental health, and I do want to say that every community stigmatizes mental health in a different way. So it's not like you and I are sitting here and it's just South Asian people who don't like really accept it. It's across the board. But what for South Asians, for us, like, our challenges are unique to our culture and our culture structures. And, we are a honor-based culture. We are a very communal, community-driven culture. And that has its benefits and its beauty and its support. But when it comes to mental health, those things can be detrimental, right? Mm-hmm. So the stigma of shame that mental health or mental illness will bring shame to the community, will bring shame to the family, is one of the biggest barriers as to why we are not able to bridge that gap between the two groups of South Asians right now. Even outside of that, there's a lot of barriers structurally. So within the South Asian community, we have our cultural barriers around stigma, around honor, around, religion or spiritual practices can kind of get misconstrued. But then structurally, and this affects almost all BIPOC communities, there is a lack of diverse providers, right? I mean, you and I are like South Asian, we're both clinicians, but we're still a minority in the larger group of, clinicians across the United States. There are language barriers. There is very low access to resource in certain communities that prevents people from even accessing care, even if they wanted to. So it's like a two-sided problem. One is kind of endemic within the culture, and one is the broader culture in North America at large.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you bringing both of those into it, because it definitely, I mean, there is a lot within the South Asian community, and that's kind of like why the both of us are talking about it, because not only do we have our clinical experience towards this, but we have a lot of personal experience too. Like, we were driven to this field for, wanting to be mental health advocates and educators and really trying to bridge that gap, but that it is really difficult with these two areas of just like the older generation and the younger generation. And it's such a big gap. Like, it's a gap that's never been seen before, because people were rooted in similar cultures. And it was actually pretty funny. My brother had texted me yesterday, and him and I are close. We text about things, but not all the time about very deep things. Like, he's a senior in college, like he's just, in a different stage. But he texted me saying, I thought of something really weird. And he was like, we're going to be the last generation that's going to have such an experience gap with their parents. Like, and he was like, Amma and Appa, which is what we call our parents, they lived in the same kind of like cultural community. They grew up in the same environment as Tata and Fatima, like their parents. And then we all choose to have children and have another generation rooted in the US or in Canada or wherever we are. We'll also have similar experiences. So it's a challenge that's so unique that a lot of people are facing right now. And there's not really the way of when you have a challenge and you can talk to someone else. Like, what was it like when you experienced this 20 years ago? Because a lot of people don't have that experience. So it's hard to even like find, yes, there's so much shame. And it's also just not knowing like where to turn, I think, too.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really interesting point. I'm kind of just like thinking about it, and it's just kind of like absorbing that you're right. I think we will also be probably the last generation who views mental health in that older way, right? Like, as we continue to grow on, and I see people who are younger than me, the Gen Zers, if you will, like, they're just crushing all kinds of like taboos around, mental health, menstrual health, like, gender identity. Like, they're just crushing all of it. So it's going to be interesting to see like how things evolve.
Yeah, and how it's going to continue to evolve, and hopefully in terms of also the providers as well, and more providers coming into the space. So it's not as white dominated of a field. And there's also like internal struggles that, I mean, I'm sure we could have another talk about that, of being clinicians of color in such a predominantly white field, and like all the struggles that come with that. And I think even just like learning about more occupations and the value of them, and breaking barriers in that way also, with a lot of cultural norms around jobs. And so I think that can sometimes be a barrier of people coming into the mental health field. But like you said, the Gen Zers, they have been, I see them on like the reels on my explore page, and it's just talking about everything. And I'm so inspired by that generation. And so I think that hopefully there's a shift also in both areas, not only like within the South Asian community, but also in terms of providers, and there's getting more representation as the younger generation comes up.
Absolutely.
Those are some of the challenges. And so now that we've kind of touched base on some of the challenges, and I mean, I'm sure that some of the people who are watching resonate with, and even there are challenges that come outside of the South Asian community, like even if you're not a member of the South Asian community, but BIPOC, and so hopefully there are parts to relate. So as we talk about just like first the challenges, I want to build upon that and talk about, even if there are challenges, like what are we going to do? So why is it important to have these conversations even when there are so many challenges and there are so many barriers to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, we look at, like I'm on Instagram, you're on Instagram, and we're talking about wellness, right? But mental health is like a very important part of our healthcare system, right? And the reason it's important to have these conversations is because it can have very dangerous consequences if left untreated or if left unaddressed, right? And why I feel like it's something that we need to kind of keep talking about more and more and more is the statistics kind of speak for themselves, right? Like a couple of years ago, I want to say 2015 or 2016, the Asian American teen girls between 12 and 15 were the highest rates for suicide in the United States, attempted suicide. Asian American youth consistently sit at higher rates for attempted suicide, whether it's like female or male, any like regardless of that previous stat, when compared to Eurocentric Americans, right? You see the consequences of poverty and racism on Black mental health. You are seeing what's happening with the Indigenous population right now in Canada and what that does to a community's mental health, right, around trauma, substance use, and suicide. So it's one thing to just kind of talk about wellness and talk about self-care and kind of be like, hey, how can you optimize good practices? But it's also important because this has a very, very important consequence. And if we don't talk about it, the problem just kind of lies under the rug and it becomes a systemic issue that people then start to blame the community for. So for the longest time, if you think about like Indigenous mental health, I'm going to talk about Canada for a little bit, Indigenous mental health over there, the predominant narrative was, oh, Indigenous people have really high alcoholism rates, and Indigenous people have a lot of trauma, and Indigenous people have a lot of, sex work, and Indigenous women go missing. There's a lot of like gender-based violence. And nobody was really talking about like the root cause, which was the trauma of the community after what has happened just, in the last 40, 50 years when it comes to like how that community was treated and what the mental health impact of that was. So to me, that's why it's important to talk about it, because the more we talk about it, the more we will empower people to not only create structural changes when it comes to mental health services, but also to understand how people are not being served, right? So Asian Americans are and this includes East Asians and South Asians, are the lowest utilizers of mental health services, right? They have high rates of mental illness, but they don't show up in the mental health system. It shows up in domestic violence calls. You get called for a DV issue, you go there, and then you see that there's some mental health substance use stuff happening. And so it's interesting, right? Like for South Asians and East Asians, we're experiencing the issue, we don't utilize the services, and then we struggle, and then people turn around and the narrative becomes the Asian American population is struggling, the immigrants are struggling, they're having a hard time. It changes the narrative. Yeah. So I mean, mental health is a health issue, but it's also like a political issue. And I think it's so important to talk about it for all of these reasons, but also just so people can live real, authentic lives, right? Living in shame is not, I don't want that for anyone. And I want people to live in their truth and be empowered by what they're navigating.
Yeah, the conversations, I mean, they touch on so many different areas, not even just in self and communities and families, systemically, it's everywhere. And so it's so important to be able to have those conversations. I really like the point of what you brought up, that we can totally advocate for self-care, advocate for wellness, but there's also intention behind that. It's not just because we should practice self-care, but it's because it's really the root of everything. And it's about living a mentally well life and living just feeling better. I think a lot of people in generations in the past, and even in our generation, has been living in so much in shame and silence and feeling off. And I've heard that so much from Asian American clients and even other BIPOC clients, of just feeling off, right? There's not a word to it because we don't have a lot of emotional language. A lot of people are not taught that, but it's just I don't feel the way that I think I should be feeling. I feel very stuck, I feel off. And then utilizing these kind of mental health treatments, knowing that these services are there to help you with emotional health. And I think there's also just like a lack of education on like what really mental health services do. I've even seen that within the community of not knowing really what therapy is. It's like, how can that help? Like, you're just talking to someone, when it's like really so much more than that. And so we
Yeah.
miscommunication with that. And even conversations around what mental health treatment is, that's even important, so we can like keep this going. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's so hard because all of it really builds on top of each other. And then it's been right now continuing to perpetuate this narrative about BIPOC and the way that we are in society, when a lot of it is not, it's based on so many other things. It's
Yeah.
just like such a layered issue.
Yeah, and I'll just add like one last point to that. I think another really important piece is like educating people in the difference between mental health and mental illness.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that can be one of the biggest barriers that like stigmatizes people from actually accessing any kind of care, is because people think any kind of distress is a mental illness, and I don't want that. I don't want that label. I don't want this on my record. Like this, a lot of people think that there's this like record that follows you. And I think that's really important, right? Because like mental health is like physical health. So you and I, we go to the gym, we eat healthy, like everyone's trying to manage their physical health. And that's kind of how I always frame mental health. Like you kind of have to find a gym for your mind so that it's preventative and it's not just like reactionary to something that's happening.
Yeah, I love the point of it being preventative, because I feel so many people seek mental health services when it's like that's the last resort, like in so much deep in crisis. It's like, I've tried everything else, nothing is working, maybe therapy will help. But I love this aspect of it being preventative and like a gym for your mind. It's so true. That's kind of like how we definitely should look at it. And so with thinking of that and all of these wonderful points that you brought up of why it's important to have these conversations, how do you believe that we can start to prioritize mental health and have these mental health conversations in the South Asian community, like actionable steps to take?
Yes. So that's like, I just love that piece, right? And what I would say about that is a couple of things. Firstly, you don't necessarily need to have a mental health issue or a struggle, right, to talk about the stuff. So you can talk about it, and you can talk about it from like an educational perspective, or like educating yourself, I think is the first thing. I think all of us could benefit from like continuing to educate ourselves. Like, you know, I read Sahaj had said in one of her recent posts from Brown Girl Therapy that I will always be a therapist in training. So I think for South Asian clinicians, like that's one thing that we can continue to educate ourselves. But even outside of clinicians, like educating yourself on what like actual mental health versus mental illness is, what is actual clinical anxiety versus feeling anxious all the time, like kind of that. And then one of like my favorite things to kind of do is when there is like a community event of some kind, whether it's like positive or a negative one. So for example, if there is a South Asian movie star who is talking about mental health, or if there like the unfortunate FedEx shooting where there was a lot of South Asian victims in that one, like I try to take these like big community moments as teachable moments for like the elders in my community. So my parents, their friends, like my older family friends, like I take this opportunity to kind of piggyback off of it and use it to start talking about mental health, right? And that I think like, you know, when you talk about like any kind of big Bollywood actor who is talking about mental health, great opportunity to start talking to your community elders about it, right? Like answer their questions. And that's how we can start normalizing it, is by just inserting it into conversations casually. Because up until now, mental health, like you said, has been like a crisis, last resort, only happens when something bad is happening. But if we can kind of envelop it and fold it into our day-to-day, yeah, even if let's say you're talking to your parents and you have an interview, talk a little about like interview anxiety, right? And so like, I think those are small ways we can begin to normalize it. And another thing that I always like to recommend if we want to start normalizing it and having these conversations in our community is to learn the language of, if it's your parents, and or an older community member. And I don't necessarily mean that as like the spoken language, but I'm talking about the jargon, right? Like speak to them in their jargon, in words that they understand, because we don't have a lot of language for this. Like across a lot of the South Asian languages, we have the formal words for it, right? But we don't know how to kind of just say, yeah, I'm feeling anxious. Like, at least when I think about it in Urdu, the translation is like worried, but that can mean for just like a regular worry. It doesn't capture that, right? So really trying to navigate the language is very helpful in getting people to have more conversations. And then doing stuff like this, right? Like, I think it's really important for people to see representation on this side instead of just as users, but also as like people who are talking about it and spreading awareness.
Yeah, those are all such great points, and especially making it into a concept that's not so abstract. I think that's what really prevents a lot of people from talking about mental health, because they're like, this is just this like unknown, unspoken like concept, but like how do we break it down? And I think really bringing it into current situations, speaking the language of what, you know, the older generation or whoever you're trying to talk to about mental health, and making that like adaptive to whoever you're speaking to. And it might look different person to person, but the way of connecting to anybody is different person to person, because we're all unique in our own ways.
I love the term you used, adaptive. I was like trying to talk through it, but you just kind of summarized it. But yeah, I think that's exactly correct.
Yeah. And I think that even just finding ways to really spread the word, and hopefully even conversations like this, or being on Instagram, social media and mental health is just taken like off. And it's just like so many resources on Instagram, so many resources online. It's so amazing, just like the communities that are being built. And hopefully those are also ways to help people with that language, because it can be hard to know really what to say. And I hope that this, and even like so many other amazing resources like you brought up, Brown Girl Therapy, are ways to start to at least learn, oh, maybe I could talk to my parents with this language, or maybe I should say this, and just give people a little bit of inspiration on how to approach the conversation.
Yeah. One of the coolest things I saw in the like come out of the internet community is a couple of months ago, when like there was a very like spike in Asian hate crime, like anti-Asian hate crime in San Francisco. There was a group that made these like flyers in all of the East Asian languages on how you can talk to your elder, like grandparents, about safety, about mental health, how you can ask them how they're feeling, because the targeted group was elderly East Asians. And it was amazing. Like, they just kept posting pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet. I'm forgetting who it was, but it was just like one person who was like, I need to do this for the elders in my community. And she just started translating it. It was really amazing.
That's amazing. Yeah. And it's just like, I've just been honestly blown away with so much of what I've seen on social media in the last year. And I think it's been obviously such a hard and dark time for so many people, especially BIPOC, in the last year. And I think just seeing so many communities come together has been just wonderful. When at least and I imagine that you relate to this, we kind of discussed this even before we got onto this discussion, but just feeling like growing up, it being a little more lonely, because you didn't have these places to turn to, you didn't have these communities, these resources. And so not knowing if your experience was like, are other people experiencing this, or is it just me? And so right now, being able to see so many people come together online is just like wonderful. And I think forming those communities is also good for our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a great discussion. I loved all of your points. You are so wonderful, insightful, knowledgeable on all of these different aspects. And it's been so great to hear more about you. So before we start to wrap this up, how can some of the people who are watching this find you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, thank you. By the way, thank you for having me here. I just love talking about this. I love the work you're doing. So I think there's a lot of like great, like, you know, sync between what you and I do. So yeah, people can find me on Instagram. It's well.guide, but also my website, israhnasir.com. And I'm sure you'll just kind of write this information down in the comment or the caption. Yeah, so I provide wellness coaching sessions, but I'm also happy to talk to somebody if they have questions about navigating the mental health space. Like, that, I have a lot of resources about that if someone's looking for a therapist and don't know where to begin. I also have a lot of free resources on my website. You can just explore it and see what you want to download. I have a couple of toolkits in there, so those are the best places. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Israa, for all you do. And yes, check out her Instagram, check out her website. She has such great resources and is just really good person to have kind of in your mental health toolbox to just know about different things. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for being here today. I'm so happy that we got to have this discussion, and I'm sure that's going to be very impactful and meaningful for a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed, and we will see you soon. All right.
Everyone.